This episode of the podcast is brought to you by our friends at Regrow, the premier cloud-based cannabis supply chain management system.
If you're a cannabis company searching for a strategic business partner to help you automate your business, scale effectively, and make the supply chain work for you, then you need to talk to the team at Regrow. Regrow is the single pane of glass view into your entire supply chain. They're available globally with native localization and foreign language support. This first-of-its-kind software leverages components of leading ERP and supply chain management systems with the necessary compliance of the cannabis industry. If you have a vertically integrated and/or multi-state operation, Regrow is the solution. They help increase your revenue while keeping your entire operation fully compliant. Visit their website at regrow.io. That's regrow.io. Regrow, the premier cloud-based cannabis supply chain management system. Hello, my fellow people of the plant. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Cannabinoid Connect podcast, your favorite podcast that includes industry-facing conversations with the industry's leading experts that aim to educate and inform the public regarding the plant's endless benefits. My guests today are Steve and Andrew DeAngelo. They're the co-founders of Harborside and Last Prisoner Project. Ladies and gentlemen, we have two very special guests on the podcast today, two living legends within the legal cannabis space. The father of the legal cannabis industry, Mr. Steve DeAngelo, and his brother, who is a big-time advocate and consultant within the industry, Mr. Andrew DeAngelo. Welcome to the show, guys. Thanks for coming on.
Nice to be with you, Kevin.
Yes,
absolutely. Be here. Thank you for having us.
Of course. And Andrew, welcome back again. I know this is the second time around, so I'm excited to have you and your brother both on. So, before we get started, there's been a lot going on this week at the federal level. And before we dive into the draft bill that was presented today by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, I want to first talk about y'all's background. Obviously, y'all are living legends in the space, and those that are in the industry know all about you and what great work y'all do. But for those that are just kind of tuning in and learning about the cannabis industry, let's just kind of give a high level of both your backgrounds and why you're so passionate about cannabis reform at the federal level. And Steve, let's start with you.
Well, the reason that I'm so passionate about cannabis reform is I fell in love with this plant when I was 13 years old and dedicated my life to legalizing it because I believe that it's the last best chance that we have to live in the kind of world that we all really want to live in. So my work with cannabis started with that first experience with the plant when I was 13 years old. And as I learned more and more about the plant, about how it had been made illegal, about why it had been illegal, I became more and more determined to change the laws. And that career started in the 1970s. From the early 70s to the early 80s, I spent that decade just doing traditional sort of street activist work, putting on smoke-ins, putting on demonstrations, traveling around the country, teaching people about cannabis. And in those days, we were really talking about freedom and individual liberty. It wasn't until we got into the 1980s that we really started talking about industrial hemp and medical cannabis. So in the 1980s, I started a company called Ecolution, and was also responsible for a medical cannabis initiative in Washington, D.C. called Initiative 59. So the 80s were sort of when we transitioned into thinking about medical cannabis. We started thinking about industrial hemp. And in the 90s is where we really brought all of that home. In 1996, we were able to pass Prop 215 in California. That's something that my brother and I were involved in. So I mentioned we were involved in doing the same thing in Washington, D.C. What most people don't know about all of those years through the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s is that my brother and I were financing those efforts largely by importing and selling pretty massive amounts of cannabis on the legacy market. And that continued until we moved to California in 2000. I joined my brother in California. And in 2006, we got a license from the city of Oakland to create the first legal licensed cannabis retail, one of the first 6 in the country. It was sort of off to the races from there. Once they started giving us licenses for legal cannabis businesses, it turned out we were very good at it. We created a bunch of them. We got kind of famous around that, and lately we've turned our efforts to making sure that all the other people who were participating in that legacy industry along with us, who didn't make it into the legal industry, people who made it into prison instead, are released, and that's our work with the Last Prisoner Project.
Mm-hmm. And that's very important work, and I'm looking forward to talking more about the efforts within the restorative justice component that Last Prisoner Project is spearheading within the industry. And so, Andrew, from your perspective, let's talk about your activism efforts. Your experience opening the first legal cannabis dispensary in Oakland, as Steve mentioned, and kind of your thoughts on the whole process.
Sure. Well, like many people in the cannabis industry that are participating now, I had a great guide and mentor, my older brother Steve, and Steve also had guides and mentors, and there's been multiple generations going back to the jazz age, really, and beyond, where folks have advocated for this plant, and particularly since prohibition, first at the state level, then at the federal level. Risk their lives, and their freedom, and to advocate for this plant. So I sort of represent a generation that's carrying the baton, and my brother sort of was the perfect mentor and guide for that. When we opened Harborside in 2006, we had already worked as activists. We'd already successfully, through ballot initiative, legalized medical in 2 very hard places to legalize, California and DC. And now we wanted to, instead of selling weed underground, like my brother mentioned, to finance all this work, well, it was time to bring that out of the shadows and into the light, as we like to say at Harborside, and start trading in cannabis in the open and legally and with a license. And my role in that, my brother was the visionary of Harborside. My role was to operate the business on the day-to-day. I did that for well over a decade, learned so much just about how to do this trading of cannabis in a setting where the public's coming into a shop, and you have to create educational experiences for folks who haven't encountered the plant before. We all had to be ambassadors and guides, just like my brother was for me. We all had to do that for our patients in those early days, and still today. Education's a big part of the cannabis retail experience. It will be for some time. We're trying to fight a tide of 100 years of prohibition, and in order to re-educate people and rebrand the plant from bad to good, we're going to have to create those experiences for folks. So once Harborside went public and my brother and I exited from the company, we turned part of our attention to social justice and started Last Prisoner Project, nonprofit organization. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a minute. I'm currently chairperson of the board of directors for the organization. So I have a big responsibility to lead and manage a team of people that do really hard work every single day. Getting people out of prison is an enormously difficult thing to do, even when they're innocent, or even when they've been locked up for something that should have never been made illegal in the first place, like cannabis. And the third thing I do right now in my current role is, as you mentioned, I'm a consultant, and that's sort of how I finance the other 2 areas of my life, which is, the social justice and telling cannabis stories like we are on this podcast. That's a big part of what Steve and I do now. And I think we have to change the perception in pop culture. You're doing it with this podcast, Kevin, and I think it's just fantastic. And that's how, slowly but surely, little bit by little bit, a few years from now, if we keep telling these stories, people won't be so freaked out about having a cannabis dispensary in their neighborhood. There won't be as much stigma and resistance to bringing the plant and integrating it into society, not just with dispensaries, but with consumption and with hospitality and with many different areas that we haven't been able to integrate yet. So that's what I'm up to these days.
Yeah, no, you're definitely busy, Andrew, and I appreciate the kind words about the podcast. And I'll tell you, I'm not planning to go anywhere. And what fascinates me about both of y'all being seasoned industry veterans is that, like, you've been at this for so long. Where I'm, guys like me who are just entering, like, I'm in the fight going on 2 years, and it's exciting, but I just can't imagine how much has changed, probably both for the good and the bad, over those years of advocacy that y'all have put in. So why don't you kind of tell me, what have been some of the wins, some of the losses along the way, the losses along the way, that in your mind has kind of helped move the needle to where we're at now, where we're sitting at, I believe the last number was 92% support overall among Americans for cannabis legalization.
Well, I think the wins far outnumber the losses. Fortunately, there were periods in my career where I couldn't say that, but I feel comfortable saying that now. And the wins are pretty easy to count. You look at Canada, you look at Mexico. Both of those countries at the highest levels of their federal government have legalized cannabis. You look at the country of Uruguay in South America. You look at the country of Luxembourg in Europe. You look at other countries around the world moving towards their own adult use legalization of cannabis. You look at I think we're up to a dozen más o menos US states right now that have full adult use legalization of cannabis, and 3/4 of the states that have some form of medical cannabis reform. Really, there's only a minority of US states, a small minority, that haven't reformed their cannabis laws in some way. And the same case is now happening around the world. It hasn't progressed quite as far around the world as it has in the United States, but remarkable things are happening. Just in the last few months, you've seen a surge by Islamic countries, which were very, very reluctant to embrace cannabis for any purposes now. You see Morocco, you see Lebanon, you see Pakistan, all of whom are legalizing cannabis for medicinal and industrial purposes. You see the same thing happening in India, which is right next door to Pakistan. And you see the same thing happening in Thailand, which is not far from India. It is a change that's sweeping every continent. The same thing in Africa. If you look at Africa, you see countries from Morocco in the north to South Africa in the south, and everywhere in between reforming their cannabis laws. Those are all big wins. We've also begun to see some of the prisoners who have been locked up during this really Holocaust. I don't know that most people recognize it, but for the past several decades, one American has been arrested every 42 seconds on cannabis charges. That's tens and tens and tens of millions of Americans who have been arrested, who have been handcuffed, who have been thrown in a cop car, have been taken to the station, who have been booked, who have had mugshots taken, who have a permanent criminal record, who have been subjected to urinalysis and probation, and all sorts of other intrusion into their lives, sometimes up to and including prison or even death. So now we're beginning to see some of those prisoners come home. Richard DeLisi, formerly the longest serving nonviolent prisoner in the United States, is now home with his family. Michael Thompson, formerly the longest serving nonviolent prisoner in the Michigan system, is now home spending time with his family. So those are wins. Passing laws and releasing prisoners, those are wins. Losses, we still have losses, right? We are just, people ask me, how far are we into this fight? We're at the top of the second inning, boys and girls. We've got a long way to go. So just 3 weeks ago, we had this absolutely horrifying 24-hour period in the state of Mississippi, where the state Supreme Court first reversed on very dubious grounds a medical cannabis initiative that 70% of the state's voters voted in favor of. And then within that same day, basically, the second highest court in the state reaffirmed the life sentence for Alan Russell, who has been convicted of possession of 30 grams of cannabis in the state
Jesus.
of Mississippi.
Wow.
And now is serving a life without parole sentence. I mean, can you imagine in this day and age being convicted and getting a life without parole sentence for an ounce of weed?
No, I can't.
Right.
No, it's
So
ridiculous.
that's, that's the losses. The losses are still happening, and we just have to fly into action and make sure that they don't continue to happen. So top of the second inning, we've made a lot of wins. We've got a great team. We've got seasoned veterans. We've got great rookies. We've got, an amazing, amazing audience that's cheering us on. We're building a new stadium, but the game's far from over.
Right.
Yep, and some other losses to mention is we've seen the way in which we are creating legalization frameworks is sometimes not fair. It's excluding legacy communities, Black and Brown communities, and so we need to do a better job with that. I'm happy to report, and I know Steve can talk more about this, but some of the newer states like New York and New Mexico have much better frameworks. Activists, really a new generation of activists, have done a terrific job with, of course, mentorship from some of the more seasoned ones among us to really learn from some of the bitter lessons like California and to make these frameworks more inclusive. As my brother mentioned, there's still a lot of details that we need to work out in both of those new states with better frameworks. And there will be lots of details we have to work out to fix the bad frameworks we have in places like California. So one of the new areas of battle and activism is getting these frameworks right and trying to create a level playing field and get as many of our warriors and pioneers, not just out of prison, but into the legal industry.
Right. No, that's well said. And I feel proud when you call out a state like New Mexico. That's the state in which I was born and raised, and I know what they did. When it comes to their legal framework, is they basically removed the social justice, social equity component of the bill and made it kind of stand alone. Right. So they wanted to tackle regulation, and then they wanted to tackle equity and social equity separately. And do you think that that's the right way to do it? I mean, when we shift our focus and talk about the federal legislation that's been proposed, do we think that the federal government is trying to bite off more they can chew by making it so comprehensive? Should these bills be separate, or can we tackle it all at once?
Well, the federal draft legislation just got released, and it's still draft legislation, so we don't know where it is going to end up. I haven't even had a chance to look at it because I've been up to my elbows looking at the legislation that's just passed in New York State. And, so I can speak in some detail about that. New York is very exciting because the state has learned from the mistakes that states like California made in implementing legalization there. So, New York has taken some very dramatic steps to make sure that the industry is diverse. 50% of the licenses in the state are reserved for social equity licensees in the state of New York. So far, far larger percentage of licenses than has been allocated anywhere. The definition of who is going to receive those licenses is still being put together, and there's an opportunity there both for positive things to happen and also for mischief to happen. So activists need to remain on the ground and make sure that promise is fulfilled. But there's a great promise there. There's also a limitation in New York that no entity, no corporation can own more than 3 retail licenses in the adult use market. That is a major, major change. No other state has enacted a prohibition like that. And it's going to force some of the largest cannabis companies in the world to alter their business model in order to be able to participate in New York. And it's going to open up a lot of those licenses for smaller business people who normally would have to compete against the corporations in order to get them. There is a provision that allows for a micro license that allows growers to grow 3,000 square feet of canopy and directly retail that cannabis to retail clients. These are measures that we've never seen anywhere. Beyond that, the state is also openly, with advocates like me, talking about creating a pathway from the legacy market to the legal market, where legacy operators would basically, be given a defined pathway in order to be able to do that and to make that transition. Again, a big shift from other markets where regulators have basically attempted to keep legacy operators out of the legal market. So if the feds would just replicate what New York did, I think that we'd have a pretty good start on the kind of industry that we really want to see.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Andrew.
Well, I was just going to add, Connecticut did just the opposite, and they banned cannabis felons from being in the market. So these battles happen in every area, and wins and losses. New York, big win. Connecticut, not so much in terms of the felony exclusion. So every day we have to wake up and do this work, and we will take some losses, and we will have to fix them later on, like we're trying to do in California right now. It's a lot harder to fix it than get it right the first time. So I'm really pleased that my brother's in New York doing that work and sort of providing guidance, because just right next door, very close by in Connecticut, we had a much different outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's obvious that, Steve, you're super close to what's happening in New York, and it seems like that would be a really good solution to emulate what they've done there, right, and apply it maybe to the federal framework. Obviously, make adjustments as needed. But to Andrew's point, I mean, what better unique position could the country be in than to learn from other mistakes of states that have gone adult use in the past, right? I mean, that's a very unique opportunity for states that are thinking to come online, to get it right, to work to get it right. And so it's good to see that some states are starting to adopt that kind of mentality. Steve, when you mentioned that, for the federal bill that was just presented, the draft, like it was an hour ago. So totally understandable that you haven't been able to wrap your head around it just yet. What I can do is I've been following Jeremy Burke very closely on Twitter. He's actually been a guest on the podcast. He's a cannabis reporter for Insider. And he tweeted out just bullet points of kind of the major components of the bill. So if y'all are good with it, I could just kind of go over each bullet and we can talk through them. Does that work?
Sure.
Perfect. So for the first draft of the federal cannabis legalization bill, which is entitled the Cannabis Administration and Opportunity Act, which is 163 pages, here are the bullets that Mr. Jeremy Burke, thank you, Jeremy, shared. So the first is cannabis would be fully descheduled. Interstate commerce would be allowed. And go ahead and pause me at any point of these bullets. The minimum age would be 21, and there'd be a 10-ounce limit. Taxes would start at 10% and they'd escalate to 25% by year 5. This one I kind of had some questions about, and I would love to get y'all's thoughts. So the regulation of legal cannabis would move from its current sitting under the DEA to be regulated by the FDA and the TTB. What are y'all's thoughts on that? Good, bad, what?
The TTB. What is the TTB?
I believe that's the Tobacco and Alcohol Bureau.
Yeah. So, I mean, until you got the end of this list, it was sounding pretty good. So deschedule cannabis. Yes. For people who are not familiar with the intricacies of this debate, the question is, do we reschedule cannabis to a less dangerous classification in the Controlled Substances Act, or do we remove it from the Controlled Substances Act entirely? So Andrew and I absolutely would support removing it entirely from the Controlled Substances Act. Interstate commerce. Yes, we think that, that cannabis businesses and the cannabis industry should be built on a national basis, just like all of our other businesses is, that cannabis consumers deserve the same economies of scale and the same range of choices and the same protections that every other type of consumer does. So we like that very much as well. When we think about taxation, what I would advocate is that for the first 3 years of any legalization measure, that there be no taxes. And the reason for that is very, very simple. There are no taxes in the legacy underground market. And if you want the above ground new legal market to succeed, you can't handicap it relative to the underground market. And so if cannabis is 10 to 25 to 50% more expensive in legal shops than it's going to be in the legacy market, people will tend to stay in the underground market longer, and it will slow down the growth of the legal industry.
Right.
Also, at a certain point, people just won't participate in the legal market if the taxes are too high. I think that 25% is pushing it. It may not be too high, but it's the very, very edge of what's too high. We found that people will pay more money to have a legal cannabis experience over an underground experience, but 25% is about the limit of how much more they'll pay. The problem is that we also have the cost of regulation. So if the only cost that we had to think about in the legal market was taxation, a rate of 10 to 25% long term, maybe we could live with. The problem is that the cost of regulation also adds another 20, 30% additional price onto the price of cannabis. And then with that tax level and the cost of regulation, you're talking about having a 50%, 60% tax burden. If that happens, if that is the tax burden on cannabis at the federal level, there will be no legal cannabis industry. It will stay underground forever. People are not going to pay 50% more for cannabis just to participate in the legal market. We've seen that happen in California, and it'll happen everywhere. So my message to the federal government, to every state, to every country that's considering this is, do not become a poster child for how not to legalize cannabis like my home state of California has done. California overregulated and overtaxed cannabis, and the consequence was that the legal market for cannabis, when it went from medical use to adult use, which was supposed to see a huge increase, actually contracted by 20%.
Wow.
And we
Andrew, your
haven't
thoughts?
even mentioned the state taxes, right? So the state taxes don't just magically evaporate and vaporize into the ether because the feds have now issued an excise tax and legalized weed. The state taxes stay in there. And guess what? Here in California, a lot of places like Massachusetts, where I am right now, they have local taxes on top of the state taxes. So if we have local taxes at anywhere from 2 to 10%, we have state taxes anywhere from 10 to 25%. Then we have Fed taxes on there, 10 to 25%. Then we have the cost of onerous regulation on top of there. My brother's absolutely right.
There won't be a legal system.
You're going to have a whole bunch of empty dispensaries that are poor few souls that don't have a connection to the legacy market and or never taken weed before in their life walk into. And you know what? I don't see them walking back in a whole lot of times with the prices at that level. So this problem of two markets is huge. It is a huge problem. Illinois, 2 markets. Massachusetts, where I am right now, 2 markets. Michigan, 2 markets. And it's not just like 80% legal, 20%. No, it's 75, 80% underground legacy and 15, 20, 25% legal. Still in California, the biggest market in the world, we're only at 25% legal. Michigan, I think, is 50% legal, maybe 60%. So it's just crazy that we're not conscious of this dual market problem. It is not just crushing legacy folks, you know, who may be in the underground market and doing better or as good, but there's going to be enforcement against them. There's going to be continued enforcement. The California funds enforcement against unlicensed operators all the time. We want that enforcement to go to big cartel grows that are polluting our forests. We want that enforcement to go to violent criminal gangs that may be in the weed trade. We don't want that enforcement going to growers up in Humboldt County or Massachusetts or people that have been running delivery services in New York for multiple generations. So these are the policy nuances and intricacies we absolutely have to get right. And that's why my brother says no taxes for a few years. Let's get everyone into this legal market, and let's get everyone to fall in love with it. Then maybe we can start turning on some taxes and just saying, hey, look, we have to take care of how we're going to integrate this in society. There's some cost involved in that. We're going to have to add a little bit of tax here. Cannabis people and consumers and Americans in general are fairly reasonable. We understand we have to do that with everything. You want to drive on a road, you got to pay a tax. So I think that is the path we would like to see. I don't know if we'll ever get no taxes for 3 years, but it would be the more intelligent design, I think.
Right. Well, and especially if, you're running on the platform of, you want everybody to have a fair shake at this industry, right? Especially the ones that have been disenfranchised, the people of color. It just seems so counterproductive to out the gate, implement high taxation that will fuel basically the legacy market, the underground market, as you mentioned, right? So it's like you're not really addressing the problem at all. You're actually making it worse.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the federal legislation, I'll have to take a look at the draft, but certainly if it does not include provisions to prevent overtaxation and overregulation, then we're just going to see the same thing repeating itself that we've seen in every other market that attempted to bring the new legal industry in over top of legacy. What we know now is legal can't compete against legacy. And so you're doing the cannabis corporations, the people who have invested hundreds of millions of dollars into creating a new industry, you're doing them no favor by trying to exclude the legacy market. In fact, it's the worst thing that you can do for people who want to build a new legal industry. And I've had conversations with people who run the largest cannabis companies in the United States, and they understand this. The regulators in New York understand this. If any state was actually trying to their market persist, which of course they shouldn't want to do, but if they were trying to, a very good way of doing that would be to do what Connecticut has just done, which is to prohibit anybody who's been convicted on a serious cannabis charge from participating in the industry. Because most people who have been participating in the industry for 10 or 20 or 30 years have caught a charge of some kind along the line. So if you want to bring that industry above ground, you would do the opposite. You don't say, hey, if you got a cannabis felony, you can't participate. You find the people who have cannabis felonies. You go to them and you say, hey, would you like to be legal? What do you need? What problems are you facing? What challenges are you facing transitioning from an illegal lifestyle to a legal lifestyle? And let us help you. That's the sensible, rational, and fair thing to do.
Right. Andrew, anything you want to add with that?
Well, we see bad behavior. Connecticut's one of them. That I'm not. Some of that was probably law enforcement lobbying those elected officials, but some of it might have been MSOs and some of the other people you didn't talk to, bro. We've seen that with home grow. We've seen a lot of big companies lobby against home grow, or maybe trade associations that have some of the bigger companies within them lobby against home grow. And of course, it's not. If you've been busted, it's a whole different story, right? You should, if anything, you should have immediate access. But home grow is similar in the sense that it does not threaten the industry. It doesn't take anybody's market share away from them. And in fact, it gets people falling deeper in love with cannabis when you grow your own. Right. And it, in fact, motivates you to consume all kinds of different types of cannabis that you can't create yourself. So guess what? You walk into a dispensary and you get that vape pen cart that you cannot produce yourself, or maybe a drink with nano emulsion technology that you cannot produce yourself. So it's just these misguided efforts. People are like trying to protect their investors and build a moat around their business, but really what they're doing is they're screwing things up for themselves and for everybody else. I'm always amazed how I call them the stoners in the suits, and I don't say that to put people in categories or boxes or generalize. I know there's a lot of diversity in both those groups, but from a public policy perspective, home grow, getting everybody into the market, making that one market large and robust is the high tide that will lift all boats. And to build a moat around a tiny little thing that in most cases in the industry right now is not profitable anyway, is kind of silly. So I think the more that we can messages and say, look, stoners and suits need good public policy to both thrive, and let the market decide, let the people decide, let the creativity, the the ingenuity that we all have to win or lose the day, and that's sort of what we would like to see happen. Sometimes I'm like, well, are stoners and suits afraid to compete with each other? They shouldn't be. Let's all get together and let's create something and learn from each other and make it better and better and better with each subsequent year that we're doing this, so that the brand of legal cannabis is something people feel really good about in society. We're in danger right now with all these fights and all this disparity and all this unequalness and all these sort of cannabis experiences that perhaps are all the same and not, made by individuals inside their individual community as much as they could be. Let's get it all together, because if we brand the legal industry incorrectly and it has a bad branding, my brother's warned about this for a long time, probably can add to this, but it threatens everybody. We do not want, it seems like the genie, it cannot ever go back into the bottle, but we have to be very mindful of this, because we really want people, because it's true. Cannabis is a good plant, not a bad plant, and it's going to do miraculous things to make our world a better place. But we have to be mindful. We have to be responsible.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we got to do it right. We got one shot, and I'd love, Steve, for you to elaborate on that notion, right, of bad branding of the legal cannabis industry. Like, talk about that.
Sure. So, I mean, 5 years ago, if you asked most people what the cannabis industry was and what it was about, they would say, oh, it's made up mostly of healing people who want to build a new world, who want to help people out, who want to give them a new kind of medicine. That was before everybody in the industry got so excited about becoming billionaires, and before the Canadian public markets opened up, and before you had cannabis companies being traded on stock exchanges. That was the prevailing public view of the industry. They thought we were the good guys. Now, with the opening of the public markets, the creation of these huge cannabis corporations, the way that some of these cannabis corporations have used their power to try and squeeze other people out of the market, the constant emphasis on the new green rush, who's in the top 100 most successful list of this or that, has now changed the public image of the cannabis industry. Most people will tell you, oh, the cannabis industry, they're just all about the money now. They're just all about the money now. And that's super dangerous, because, if we're just only about the money and there's any shadow of a doubt in anybody's mind about this plant, then we look really bad. Okay. But if this is really a good plant that helps and heals people, which is what we should be talking about, then we're the good guys. So we've basically shot ourselves in the foot and given ammunition to the people who still would like to make cannabis illegal.
That is such a great point. And just to piggyback on what you're saying, Steve, is if I've had direct discussions with, people on the opposing side, the prohibitionist side, and that has been something that they lean heavily on, is that like their go-to argument is the industry is greedy. They just, they're out for money, and that's all it is. And while that may be true within a small percentage, or I mean, you would know the exact percentage of that overall within the industry, like that's not what I see it as being, right? And I know that that's not what you or your brother see it as being, but it's to back to your branding example, it's just kind of like you said, we've shot ourselves in the foot in a way.
Well, there's a battle for the soul of the cannabis industry going on right now. Every cannabis consumer is a soldier in in those battles, whether they know it or not. There are still, I believe, in this industry, most of the people who are participating because they love this plant, have been called by this plant. They believe that this plant is a healer and a teacher that will help us build the world we really want to live in. But there is a minority of people who have come into the industry in recent years who are all about the money. The kind of people who walk into a room and see a table laid with a magnificent banquet and think it's their job to grab every single bit of food on that table and not leave a crumb for anybody else. We have to make sure that we have the ability to identify who those people are and make sure that we deprive them of our consumer dollars. So if you are a cannabis consumer, know the company that you're buying your cannabis from. How do they treat their workers? What does their board look like? Does it look like your community or does it look like something else, right? What are they doing with all of the money that they're making? Are they supporting organizations like the Last Prisoner Project or DPA or Normal? Are they doing anything for activism? Do they have incubators? Are they trying to help make the organization or the industry more diverse? Are their practices sustainable? What's their packaging look like? Know where you buy your cannabis company, know where you buy your cannabis from, and make sure that you're buying it from a company whose values are in alignment with your own values. If we do that, then we're going to empower people who love this plant, and we will take back this industry. If we don't, then we're going to give it to the corporations.
Mm-hmm. Andrew, anything to add there?
Well, I think my brother put it very well. The battle of the soul of the Cannabis Party is on us right now, and it's quite a battle, and so we need every single person on deck. It is emotionally very hard for people like us to see the value of greed sort of eclipsing some of these other values that the plant teaches us about generosity and sustainability and diversity and inclusion. So it's just driving us crazy, and it's driving a lot of people in the legacy and the cannabis community, and it's going to motivate us to wage this fight for the soul of the cannabis industry. But my brother's right. At the end of the day, there's only so many leaders, there's only so many activists. It's going to come down to the cannabis consumers being really smart and supporting the outfits that speak to them and their values the most.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's sound advice from both of y'all. Thank you so much. To wrap up the discussion around the federal bill that was drafted and presented today, I'll just quickly go through some of the other points, and then specifically the social justice and social equity components of that. So to round it off, incentivize research into cannabis. Federal agencies would be prohibited from using past cannabis consumption to deny security clearances. States would have the right to decide how to regulate cannabis within their borders. And then specifically for the restorative justice and social equity components. So expungement of records, community reinvestment. It would allow people to petition for resentencing, and it would remove collateral consequences like immigration related penalties for people who've been criminalized over the plant. Thoughts on those components of the bill?
Well, I know the Last Prisoner Project's been working with the drafters of the bill. It's still a draft bill, and so I would say that we're supportive of the efforts that have been made to include our priorities in that bill. But I would say this: there's one very simple principle that I think needs to be embodied in every single piece of cannabis legislation going forward, and that's this: if something's not illegal anymore, you have to release everybody who's in prison for doing that thing that's not illegal anymore, period. The
Yeah, that's
next
common
day,
sense. That's
okay?
common sense. Yeah.
Yeah,
And that principle has to be embodied in whatever happens, okay? If we, as a society, have decided that the thing that was illegal shouldn't be illegal anymore, then you can't punish people for the thing that's not wrong anymore, okay? That's not right.
Right.
yeah, we call it retroactive release. It's something Last Prisoner Project and other groups that do this work have been fighting for at the state level. We haven't been able to get it at the state level either. Not one state has passed retroactive release. And now the feds are, have this framework. It's a draft, like my brother said. So lots of activists, not just Last Prisoner Project, are in the room. Credit to the Biden administration, or at least these senators and Congress people. They're getting us in the room. Okay. We're not out of the room. We're in the room. And let's see what happens. Maybe we can get retroactive release in there if enough people raise help listening to the messages of this podcast and others. And maybe we can get even, better terms in the social justice. I like the expungement. I like the security clearance. Some of those provisions are really good, but they're pretty low hanging fruit. And I don't think you should have to apply for resentencing. What, you're going to apply for resentencing? Apply to get out, apply to be released. So
No, you actually shouldn't have to apply for anything, okay? It should be incumbent upon the governor's office and the Department of Corrections. It should be incumbent upon the federal Department of Corrections to identify every single prisoner that is incarcerated on cannabis charges and release them immediately. It should not be something that anybody else has to do. It wasn't us that went out and arrested ourselves. Right. It wasn't us that went out and imprisoned ourselves. It's not us who's voluntarily remaining in prison. It's incumbent on the people who wrote these laws and executed these laws and imprisoned us to release us.
Yeah, that's well said. I 100% agree with that. I mean, the onus is on them. I mean, they're the ones that implemented these dubious laws. And so why is it on the person who was convicted for the dubious law to then have to themselves go through the process of applying to, to be resentenced or even expunged for something that is not even legal or illegal anymore, to your point, Steve? Yeah, it's crazy. And so one thing that, Andrew, you talked about that you just kind of made me have an aha moment, right? So when I hear the term expungement of records, obviously expunging of prior offenses related to cannabis, right? But when you talked about retroactive release, there isn't any language in the bill now, or even among the states, is what I hear you guys are saying, that where people that are currently incarcerated are not retroactively being released once that state has gone adult use. Is that right?
Yeah, no, I mean, your tone of incredulity is well placed, because most normal people think that if you make something not illegal anymore, that the people who are locked up for doing the thing that's not illegal would just be
right.
released.
That's
right?
what I would
It's just,
assume. Yeah.
no, that is not what has happened. And one of the major reasons that it happens is because law enforcement organizations come to the table and they say, those people knew the law was the law. They chose to break the law. They are criminals and they must pay. And what we know is really the truth is that nobody who carried this kind and gentle plant of enlightenment through prohibition is a criminal. They were never criminals. They're heroes. We wouldn't be here today with access to this beautiful plant that's doing so much good in the world if people hadn't risked their lives to carry it through prohibition. They're not criminals. They're heroes. The real criminals are the people that wrote these laws, that prosecuted us, that locked us up in the face of mountains and mountains of scientific evidence that it was not the right thing to do. So let's just be clear here. we're not the criminals. The people who wrote these laws and who still enforce these laws are the real criminals.
And you're right, Kevin. The assumption with the general public is there is retroactive release.
Right.
You know, I talk to people all the time. They're like, what do you mean? What do you mean? You have to have this nonprofit that get, what are you talking about? There's no one in jail for weed. No, there are. And we don't have retroactive release. And so we have to sort of shoot that assumption down because it's false. And this is why we talk about retroactive release so much, because we haven't gotten it. And, you know, it's like my brother said, it's wrongful imprisonment. It was wrongful imprisonment. People get sued all the time for wrongful termination of your job. That's not taking your freedom away per se. That's not locking you in a cage. Okay. And what? Wrongful imprisonment is not worse than that. It's much worse than that. No one should be wrongfully imprisoned. And everybody locked up for weed has been wrongfully imprisoned. And in many cases, died in prison or died, you know, getting arrested or resisting arrest. So it's something that is an area of education that's badly needed.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate you making that distinction and bringing it up, because I know myself, I'm going to start hammering out that word retroactive release and making it, you know, top of discussion, because that should definitely be included in this federal legalization bill. Excuse me. I mean, that is a no-brainer, right? I mean, expungement of records is great, but how I can't imagine how I would feel sitting in prison. And I know you guys are living this every day because you work with these people to try to get them out, but sitting in prison, locked in prison for years, when you're hearing on the outside that, you know, markets are thriving, businesses are thriving in certain states due to legalization, that is insane. So that definitely needs to be addressed. Absolutely.
And maybe we'll get it in, you know, maybe we'll get retroactive release in the bill. They're taking comments until September 1st. So don't be shy, everybody, submit one.
That's right. To wrap things up, guys, I want to talk about two more things here. And one, I want to get your thoughts on the recent announcement from the private sector when it comes to the large corporations like Amazon, who have publicly announced that, one, they're going to, you know, reform their drug testing policy for certain employees, but then they've also publicly said that they're actually going to lobby now for cannabis legalization at the federal level. Now, obviously, there are, you know, advantages and benefits to a company like Amazon because there is incentive for them to lobby, but you know, from a activist perspective, you know, is this good? Is this monumental? Is this something that will help move the needle even more? Goods, bads? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's you know, go ahead, bro.
Well, it's pretty monumental. Urinalysis testing in particular is a scourge in our society. It started, I remember it very well because I was a teenager coming up. I was just starting to take cannabis in the early 1980s when all this urinalysis testing for cannabis started. And it's been 40 years of just terror for the American worker. I myself failed 2 piss tests trying to get a summer job cleaning toilets on the Amtrak train. Now, I don't know how I could have done that job without being stoned. But in any case, you know, I could not get the summer job. And I ended up having to work the graveyard shift in a 7-Eleven for that summer because I could not pass the piss test at a company my father worked for.
Well,
you know, so there was no exceptions, you know, and even though I look like this, I still, you know, was denied those jobs. And this has happened to tens of millions of workers. They stopped smoking weed so that they could stay employed. They lost touch with the plant. In some cases, they took more dangerous substances like alcohol and hard drugs. We now have an opioid overdose epidemic. We've had an alcoholism epidemic since that urinalysis testing. So I think that Amazon's announcement will create a domino effect with respect to this particular issue. I certainly hope so. Some of the other motivations that big corporations might be having, you know, may be more threatening to our community. with respect to urinalysis testing, I think it's a huge milestone, and I'm thrilled to see Amazon take that step. Even though, let's be clear, they took it because somebody sued them. Let's be really clear.
Right.
A worker sued them from a state where weed is legal, and so there was some activism involved in that decision too.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah, I'm not that terribly impressed. The Department of Justice itself, many years ago, realized that they had to waive cannabis tests for people who were working in their cybercrime unit because they couldn't recruit sufficient people to work in the cybercrime unit of sufficient skill that didn't smoke weed.
Right.
Everybody was just like, "Fuck you, we're not going to work for you then," right?
I didn't know that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was, 7, 8, 9 years ago. It was that was during Obama that happened. And I think that other American corporations have found the same thing. The question is when will the rest of corporate America do the right thing? If there was any other issue on which 92% of Americans agreed, the corporations would be way out front on it. They'd be running ads with little cannabis leaves or whatever their other symbols are, right? I mean, you talk about pride. And, do you think 92% of Americans are in favor of gay pride? Probably not.
Right.
But if you take a look at what corporate America did to celebrate pride versus what they have done to support cannabis reform, it's a shameful record.
It is a shameful
for corporate
record.
America to step up if they want to reap the rewards, and I'm sure Amazon does want to reap the rewards. Then it's time for them to stop standing on the sidelines and jump into this fight because we need their help.
I totally agree. And all they push at the corporate level, me being a former corporate marketing professional, it's diversity, it's inclusion, it's, all that stuff. And when you look at the history of prohibition in cannabis, I mean, it intersects with all that, right? I mean, as y'all know, racial injustice, all everything that falls under what prohibition, the umbrella of prohibition. And yet, like you said, they've been on the sidelines. And so I really appreciate your feedback on that because I'm curious. Go ahead.
Well, maybe we need retroactive banning of urinalysis testing for cannabis. Because while I'm excited,
maybe just an apology.
Right. And Andrew, you're not the only one.
Or both. It'd be nice if we could stop it.
Right. Andrew, I can relate. So you mentioned you failed drug tests, at the Amtrak toilet and whatnot. I failed a couple of drug tests in my day, and I actually was responsible at one company to basically revise the entire corporate policy because I had consumed in a state where it was legal. And I was within that time frame of cannabis being in your system still. So they had to reevaluate that as a company, and they had to revise that particular regulation and rule. So I'm with you, man.
That kind of activism is what it takes, right? Exactly what you did there. So anyone listening that is in a similar position, go ahead and get that policy changed in your organization because it's brutally unfair and wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. Talk to your HR departments for sure. So last question, to wrap things up, obviously y'all are very passionate and hyper focused on what we've talked about, mainly, which is that restorative justice component. Obviously, Andrew, you're also a consultant within the industry, but why don't you tell me, what are y'all focused on for the remainder of this year? As it relates to the Last Prisoner project or maybe other projects that you're working on right now?
Well, I'm in the process of relocating to New York, where I'm going to be building a major venture that's designed to address the two main challenges that every social equity licensee in New York is going to face, which is number one, getting the money, the capital that they need to develop their license, and making sure that they have enough of the skill set that they're going to need to succeed. So that will be my focus for the next couple of years, because I believe that New York offers us the best opportunity to build a diverse, broad-based industry that spreads wealth widely and welcomes legacy players into the legal system.
Amazing. Thank you. Andrew, how about you?
Well, my life falls into three main buckets right now. Last Prisoner Project's probably the most important one. I spend a good 25% of my time in my role as chairperson of the board there. As a consultant, of course, I help people build integrated cannabis companies, mostly in states that are a little bit newer on the scene, not so much California anymore. And I do also try to inject as much of my values into those companies and clients that I work with, and try to get them on board with as being active as they can to restore justice. And then we do a lot of creative work, as I mentioned. So I have a column for Forbes that I write, and I appear a lot. And we are cooking up some larger, more ambitious cannabis stories right now, my brother and I. And again, I just think it's an area. One, I have a background in storytelling, so I love to do it. It's a passion of mine. And I also am frustrated when I hear folks talk about this stigma, whether it be people that don't want a dispensary in their neighborhood, or whether it be people who don't know about retroactive release, or whether it be any number of other things. And the stories that we tell to each other and to the world is how we're going to gain a deeper understanding. Because even within our own community, all of the folks that have been locked up for many decades, many of those folks, most of those folks don't look like me and my brother, right? And so developing empathy and understanding within our own tribe of all these different groups with all these different levels of society, all these different expressions of societies, and making sure we understand each other really well, and that we're listening to each other, that we're taking to heart each other's experiences, so that we can craft businesses, frameworks, nonprofit organizations, in fact, an entire global economy together. And so that area of my work, I'm very passionate about. I don't get to do as much storytelling as I would like, because we have to make a living like everybody. But that's sort of the three areas that I'm working in the most right now.
That's exciting. Yeah. And to your point, I mean, the plant touches all demographics of life, right? So what better time to all of us to come together and, you know, put forth education and awareness to where we're moving these policymakers to implement more common sense cannabis laws. And I just got to tell you, today it's just been an honor. I'm humbled to have you both on, living legends within the cannabis industry. Really appreciate your insights, guys. Before we wrap up, where can people find y'all on social media or the Last Prisoner Project's website if they want to learn more about your work?
LastPrisonerProject.org is our website. We also have a great tab called Get Involved or Get Active, one of those two. And you can donate on that tab. You can write a letter to a cannabis prisoner on that tab. There's lots of ways you can plug in that you don't have to actually pay money for. So we've made that very active on our website. I'm AndrewDeAngelo.com, and most of the social media platforms, I'm Andrew_DeAngelo.
Perfect. And Steve, any last words from you, sir?
SteveDeAngelo.com, at Steve.DeAngelo on IG, and on most of the other platforms on YouTube. Be sure to check out Radio Free Cannabis, which is my monthly global cannabis news and activism show.
Love it. Thank you guys so much again. I really appreciate it. I know the audience is going to get a ton of insights out of this episode. So keep blazing the trails, guys. We look up to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
Yes.
Thank you, Kevin. Nice to be with you today.
See you, Kevin.
And thank you all for listening. Bye.
Bye.